Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is November of 2018. This is going to be part 2 in a 4-part series where I'm covering how the left plans to map out and then ultimately attempt to siphon off into electronic gulags all of its opponents. In part 1, I covered Barry Weiss's New York Times article, Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web, where they began this HUMINT or Human Intelligence Mapping process, and also where they were attempting to set up the semi-acceptable alternative to the mainstream media. From there, they are going to begin mapping those who are deemed to be off-limits and are not acceptable, and will be on the target list for being siphoned off to the electronic gulags. Part 2 is going to review Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online by Alice Marwick and Rebecca Lewis of Data and Society. Part 3 will cover the Alternative Influence article, or AIN, Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube. And then Part 4 will review the Atlantic Council's article, Whose Truth? Sovereignty, Disinformation, and Winning the Battle of Trust. And that is the one that sets the ultimate overview for what the plan is going to be. As I set out in Part 1, the best model for understanding this should be seen under the rubric of the way that Obama unleashed the CIA in order to engage in domestic manipulation of information on the public. 2 would be COINTELPRO, and 3 would be Cass Sunstein's concept of cognitive infiltration. If the listener doesn't understand those, I will have Part 1 linked below. You can go back and watch that, where I set out their overall agenda. As we begin, the manipulative nature of this article is notable immediately from the opening image. On the cover, we have a dark-skinned person and a light-skinned person. The light-skinned person has a blindfold over their eyes. The other person has their eyes closed and their mouth open as if they are screaming in the face of the person with the blindfold, but the blindfold appears to be actually emanating from the screamer's mouth. In effect, they are putting the blindfold on other people. That is essentially the claim of this article. And although this article seems to have all of the ordinary accoutrements one would expect from a scholarly article, and this is from datasociety.net, Data and Society Research Institute. I will also link this below so that you can check it out for yourself. It is anything but scholarly. It never offers anything even approaching objectivity or neutrality. It is all directly from a far left-wing perspective, which assumes that that is the only acceptable perspective anyone in the world may hold, and anything else that opposes that is the enemy. I'm actually going to begin by reviewing a few of my conclusions about the article overall before jumping into it. So the first thing that I would point out is that this really solidifies my own thesis that nationalism and populism will continue to rise unchecked because the left fundamentally misunderstands those who oppose them right now. They are so ideologically obsessed, so ideologically entrapped by their own worldview that they cannot possibly even conceive anyone would ever disagree with anything that they say or claim. I would like to point out that in the more than 100 pages in this report, it never mentions the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. It never mentions that the United States is a republic. However, it makes numerous references to the concept of it being a democracy. It's also notable that this article pretends that white supremacism rests at the core of the resistance to the left rather than at the periphery, a very, very tiny periphery, I would point out. I would also point out that reports such as this are used in order to program so-called neutral or objective content filters that usually run through, say, free Wi-Fi providers and other sources. I would also like to point out that this report is very low on the concept of either independence or self-reliance. It doesn't attribute very much of that to the people who listen to these programs that they cover. Other things that immediately jump out in the article is that you can really tell that the authors of this, and really the entire far left in general, really hates the idea that anyone gets to bypass them, gets to bypass, say, the K-12 educational system or the university system or the mainstream media so that they can speak directly to one another. They really don't like that because what they enjoy are captive audiences who get spoken to or spoken at, but do not get spoken with. There can be no dialogue or exchange. They don't like that at all. Next, I would also like to say that this is an example of them conducting what is known as enemy reconnaissance. They are identifying and marking targets for attack and ultimately for some form of destruction. It's a form of sort of mapping their enemy's territory. And I'll also note that the article or report continually engages in the blurring of the lines and eliminationism, where it says basically, being a conservative is almost exactly like being an overt white supremacist, and being a libertarian is almost just like being a conservative. Therefore, being a libertarian or a conservative is to be a white supremacist or a white nationalist. That is the implication that is repeatedly drawn out within this report. And just a couple of more points briefly. I'll say that the left very frequently lies not simply by what it is that they say, but it's also by what they avoid saying, by the things that they omit, information that they do not tell you, that they certainly must have a responsibility to actually know. And the other thing is you can tell that they really have a nostalgia, for this era where they had captive audiences, and they're losing those captive audiences now. I remember when I was growing up in the 1980s that we usually had just 3, maybe 4 channels, and you had no real options at all for news whatsoever. Maybe you would get a morning paper, perhaps an afternoon paper, but of course all of these sources of information were closed off and very highly restrictive of what you could actually know. It most certainly did not constitute the sort of open dialogue that we're able to have now. And that's what they would really like to return us to, is this era where it's all ABC, NBC, CBS, maybe CNN and MSNBC, and they get to dictate to you what it is that counts as news and information. You also have to pay attention to the way that news services are inherently manipulative of what they show as objective and neutral information. So one of the things that happens is that left always wants to pretend that, for example, CNN or CBS or something like that offers you a neutral political opinion. And what they do is they'll shift between, say, giving you something like the weather, which is obviously neutral and objective. You can check the data, check the facts, and there's nothing being imputed to it unless they're talking about, say, climate change or global warming or something like that. But usually they don't inject that into just, say, the 7-day forecast. The other way that they do this, they give sports news, sports scores. These things are objective as well. They'll show you maybe the traffic report or something. There's accidents out on the interstate or whatever. You're going to be late to work or something like that. But then they'll transition directly over into their far left ideological interpretations of whatever's happening in the government. But then they also try to pretend that this is neutral and objective, and it really isn't. However, it does trick the mind to think that they're doing the same thing as they go topic to topic, but they're really not. So they'll cover, say, a local crime report or something like that, or there's been a local arson or something, someone's house burned down, they need to catch the bad guy and all this, and then they'll switch directly from that to saying, Trump is orange man is evil, so on and so forth. And it was the same, back when Bush was president, the same thing when Obama was president. They switch over. Everything Obama does is good and great and wonderful. Hillary's amazing and wonderful. Bill Clinton's amazing and wonderful, and of course, Bush before that was bad, so on and so forth. It's just so obvious once you start to see through it, but they don't want you to see through it. And by the way, I'm not saying that Bush or Trump or anyone like that is always good. I certainly don't believe that at all. So now I'm going to open up with their executive summary, point by point. They begin. Internet subcultures take advantage of the current media ecosystem to manipulate news frames, set agendas, and propagate ideas. My comment on this is, this presupposes that the mainstream media does not engage in these things. Next point. Far-right groups have developed techniques of, quote, attention hacking to increase the visibility of their ideas through the strategic use of social media, memes, and bots, as well as by targeting journalists, bloggers, and influencers to help spread content. Note that they use 2 terms there that are emotionally coded in a certain way. So you have the use of the word hacking, which has a connotation to us of something negative, that someone is breaking into or invading some space that they do not belong in. The other one is they use targeting, because that also sounds like you're aiming at someone and about to shoot them. This is how they do the emotional encoding process that I talked about in the IDW article. Also, it presupposes that these things are all bad and that the left never engages in these things. Next point. The media's dependence on social media, analytics and metrics, sensationalism, novelty over newsworthiness, and clickbait makes them vulnerable to such media manipulation. Well, this is the old if it bleeds, it leads concept. And effectively, by making this point here, what they're calling for is people to ignore or to silence the opposition to the left entirely. Next point. While trolls, white nationalists, men's rights activists, gamergaters, the quote alt-right, and conspiracy theorists may diverge deeply in their beliefs, they share tactics and converge on common issues. So again, here I'll point out, this presupposes that the left doesn't do this and that the mainstream media is true and right and always good. Next, the far right exploits young men's rebellion and dislike of political correctness, it has that in quotes, to spread white supremacist thought, Islamophobia, and misogyny through irony and knowledge of internet culture. This translates basically to everything that the left dislikes is wrongthink, and you're not allowed to speak that way. Next point. Media manipulation may contribute to decreased trust of mainstream media, increased misinformation, and further radicalization. This presupposes that we should trust the mainstream media and that the media does not engage in systematic and constant leftist agenda pushing. And it also assumes that distrust wasn't already very high already. And of course, it is getting worse and worse the more that we're able to speak to each other and expose the incessant lies of the mainstream media. Now I will quote a few brief sections here for review. Understanding media manipulation. In early October 2016, WikiLeaks posted a dump of 20,000 hacked emails from the Gmail account of John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman. Now, I would point out here that many people say that this actually was not hacked and that it was indeed leaked from the inside. People suggest this could have been the late Mr. Seth Rich. Users on an internet message board called 8chan/poll, short for politically incorrect, immediately began combing through the emails looking for damaging material about Hillary Clinton. Using social media, they spread, quote, allegations, those are my quotes by the way, that George Soros was funding liberal protesters to disrupt Trump rallies. This, of course, did happen. That a vast ring of pedophiles was operating out of a Chevy Chase, Maryland pizza parlor, and that Clinton had a secret desire to assassinate Julian Assange. I don't think it was all that secret. I think that notion was in there. Can't we just bomb him? Despite the spurious, even fantastical nature of such allegations, they spread through the social media to far-right blogs and eventually to the mainstream media. As one 8chan poster wrote, quote, the media isn't doing their job. With thousands of emails released, the only things they've reported on even marginally has been what we've dug up. They literally can't be bothered to do any digging at all. And this is, of course, completely true. You even had CNN's Cuomo go on air and tell the public that it was illegal for them to have WikiLeaks and that only CNN could be trusted to report on it.
Also interesting is, remember, it's illegal to possess these stolen documents. It's different for the media. So everything you learn about this, you're learning from us. And in full disclosure, let's take a look at what is in there and what it means. Joining us now, CNN.
Now, the next paragraph gets really interesting. In the months leading up to the 2016 U.S. election, which is really at the heart of this entire matter, is they just can't believe that the New York Times' 98% chance that Hillary would win actually was wrong. A number of subcultural groups who organize online made a concerted effort to manipulate the existing media infrastructure to promote pro-Trump populist messages. These messages spread through memes shared on blogs and Facebook, through Twitter bots, through YouTube channels, and even to the Twitter account of Trump himself, and were propagated by a far-right hyper-partisan press rooted in conspiracy theories and disinformation. And of course here, this pretends that the mainstream media is neutral and objective, and when they are all hyper-partisan leftists themselves. Returning to the article here, They influence the agenda of mainstream news sources like cable television, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, which covered Clinton conspiracy theories more than Trump's alleged sexual assaults and ties to Russia, which is, of course, a conspiracy theory. You'll note here that they have absolutely zero self-awareness of their own positions at all. They never question any of the views that they hold because that's not allowed. That's wrongthink for the left. I continue here. However, scholars Whitney Phillips, Jessica Beyer, and Gabriella Coleman are skeptical of the narrative that 4chan and the alt-right were the critical force underwriting Trump's success, arguing that this explanation minimizes broader sociocultural trends and gives too much power to a very small number of people. There is still a great deal of ambiguity around the outcome of the election and why the majority of experts and predictions did not foresee Trump's win. This part here, I would say, reveals that the left is absolutely panic-stricken that their great high goddess Hillary actually lost. Moving down a bit more, in this report we delve into how various internet subcultures, sometimes summarized as the alt-right, but more accurately an amalgam of conspiracy theorists, techno-libertarians, white nationalists, men's rights advocates, trolls, anti-feminists, anti-immigration activists, and bored young people, leverage both the techniques of participatory culture and the affordances of social media to spread their various beliefs. The comment here on this would be, oh really? You mean that they talk to one another rather than the left's method of just being talked at? This is a form of totalitarian paternalism. And you really have to understand that at the heart of this, the left thinks that YouTube is supposed to be strictly for cat videos, and that Facebook is supposed to be strictly for showing like pictures of your family, talking to your friends, and basically making hookups from people that you knew in the past. And as we continue in the article here, you'll hear just how Orwellian this takes a turn here. It says, taking advantage of the opportunity the internet presents for collaboration, communication, and peer production, these groups target vulnerabilities in the news media ecosystem to increase the visibility of an audience for their messages. While such subcultures are diverse, they generally package themselves as anti-establishment in their reaction against multiculturalism and globalism, while promoting racist, anti-feminist, and anti-Semitic ideologies. We use the term far-right to characterize these players collectively, though many of these communities resist identification with the term. Could that possibly be because they're not? Did you not just point out in this exact same paragraph that many of these people are not alt-right, that they are conspiracy theorists, techno-libertarians, all kinds of other groups? You literally just made the transition in this one article, in this one paragraph of this article, to say that they're all racist and anti-Semitic and white supremacist. This is completely absurd. To understand the context for media manipulation and disinformation, we must go down several rabbit holes. A variety of different movements, moments, and developments have coincided to shape the contemporary media landscape. While it is impossible to ascertain its impact on the U.S. election, it is important to examine the relationship between internet subcultures and narratives put forward by various media organizations. What follows is an attempt to parse out and create definitions around the moving pieces of the loosely connected network, namely, who is involved, their motivations, and where they operate online. This mapping is by no means comprehensive, and the categories identified here are not always distinct from each other. Like I said, this is a reconnaissance effort. This is a mapping of enemy territory in order to identify targets for eventual elimination. On to the next section, who is manipulating the media? The term alt-right is a neologism that puts a fresh coat of paint on some very long-standing racist and misogynist ideas. It can be convenient to use the term as a catch-all for the groups involved in far-right media manipulation, but while many of the groups we identify in this report can be characterized as such, others cannot. Many of these segments have their own agendas, but, as this document details, share similar tactics. So sharing tactics means you're evil, even though the left engages in these same tactics. Furthermore, some participants in this ecosystem are organized by their beliefs, like men's rights activists, because men shouldn't have any rights, while others are organized by particular media or platforms such as individual blogs or podcasts. Thus, the lines between these groups are always blurry and uneven. And should that not indicate to you that your theories are actually wrong? Oh no, we'll proceed ahead. Then they have a ridiculous section here on internet trolling, where they end up saying that trolling has grown to serve as an umbrella term which encompasses a wide variety of asocial internet behaviors, because they're here to determine what are appropriate internet behaviors. They're going to tell you what that is. And as I also would like to point out here, them lumping everyone together who opposes them as simply bigots and supremacists, that's fine for the left to engage in. That isn't dehumanizing at all. Calling everyone Russian bots is not dehumanizing at all, but the NPC meme must be banned immediately because it's dehumanizing of the left. And as I move down further in the trolling section here, they have what they call 4 properties that are key to understanding the current practices of media manipulation. And 2 of the 4 really stand out as interesting, shall we say. Point here says, antipathy towards sensationalism in the mainstream media, which this very document has already expressed itself, and which I think is a very common feeling that most of us have about the mainstream media. They are ridiculous. Next point, the desire to create emotional impact in targets. So apparently we are all supposed to be robots, and that's actually a good thing, which we should be dehumanized, but dehumanization is bad. Does not compute. My head is blowing up. In the next section here, they really begin the blurring of the lines once more that I pointed out to you earlier. It says under the category of offensive speech, and then it immediately begins, hate speech violates sensibilities. Now, I'll point out to you there are no laws in the Constitution regarding hate speech. There is just free speech. But don't you find it interesting how they make this move here from offensive speech to hate speech? Because the concept they're trying to drive at here is that if something offends someone, on the left that is, they eventually want those things to be banned. If you offend the right, or you offend Christians, or anything like that, who cares? Nobody cares. And indeed, the final sentence in this paragraph here on offensive speech, so-called hate speech, it says, this practice also dovetails with an extremist commitment to, quote, free speech, which is strongly tied to the polarized discourse against political correctness. So now you have to be politically correct, and you have to dislike free speech, because to be committed to free speech is extremist. I don't recall the left making any of these arguments back when they were promoting pornography. Anyone remember that? On the next page, we find an image of dozens of hands going to cover up the eyes of apparently an elderly person. But I don't recall the left or the mainstream media ever doing anything that confused or lied to a lot of people. Nothing like weapons of mass destruction, that whole little war thing in Iraq, or any of that. No. You need to be worried about internet trolls. I'm going to skip most of the section on Gamergate. That's been covered a million times and far better by people who are actually involved in it. But under a section down here called Networked Groups, they say, Gamergate shows that groups of people with all sorts of ideological conflicts, from white supremacists to libertarians, again, notice how they blur the lines there, to video game fans to men's rights activists, can and will come together around a common cause and just as quickly disappear. These groups are networked and agile. But that could not possibly ever be, because what they oppose is actually something bad. That's the implication. Next section here, retrograde populism. Gamergate participants asserted that feminism and progressive causes in general are trying to stifle free speech, one of their most cherished values. Of course, this entire document is all about the stifling of free speech. They are reacting to what they see as the domination of the world by global multiculturalism and the rise of popular feminism. This is a retrograde populist ideology which reacts violently to suggestions of white male privilege, is directly linked to the language of the men's rights movement, and is also present in the messaging of the alt-right. Notice here that they put reacts violently but this is an assertion without any evidence whatsoever. They also say that it's retrograde just because their position is far left progressivism. They get to define what is progressive and what is retrograde. They always want to control and manipulate language. I'd also like to point out here that when they talk about feminism and the opposition to feminism, which I also mentioned in the first episode of this series, they're not talking about first wave and generally second wave feminism. They're talking about third wave and the emergent fourth wave feminism that's basically male eliminationism, the type that says women need men like fish need a bicycle. Okay, first wave feminism was about women achieving the rights to own property and able to vote and run for political office. Second wave feminism had a little bit more to do with, say, sexual liberation and the ability of women to work outside of the home and pursue executive careers, open up their own businesses, so on and so forth. All of those things are fine. I don't think anybody has too much of a problem with that. Where people start to have a problem is when third wave and fourth wave feminists start saying that boys are really bad. People don't like that. They have brothers, they have fathers, they have other males in their life who they know are actually good people and should not be discriminated against just because third wave feminism. A bit later, they edify us with yet another image that shows a whole lot of faces that are screaming, and basically the screaming is depicted to look like it's fire coming out of the mouth or perhaps a lot of spittle. And I would also point out that this imagery is very dehumanizing, and it's even worse than the NPC meme. But you have to remember the rules for the left. It's always okay when the left does it, never okay when any opponent of the left does anything, okay? And on page 11, although I, of course, am not alt-right, I'm not right, I'm not conservative, none of that sort of thing, I am a libertarian, we have this interesting little ditty here where they say, the term alt-right, however, fulfilled several other goals. As a neologism, it allowed ideas long seen as unacceptable to mainstream media. Get that? Unacceptable to mainstream media, because the far left ideologues in the media get to tell you what is acceptable and not acceptable. And for the final couple of sentences, what we find on this page is it says here, attempting to form coherence out of this loose aggregate is very difficult. Ambiguity is itself a strategy. It allows participants to dissociate themselves with particularly unappetizing elements while still promoting the overall movement. What in the hell does that even mean? Again, what this boils down to is that it's good for the left to do, but it's evil for everyone else who's against the left to do. And a bit later down, what we find here is they have drawn out some bullet points that they think are quite, as they say, perceptive, drawn from the writings of M. Dekar. And it says here in the second point, the alt-right is characterized by fear of difference, whether difference be sexual, gendered, religious, or racial. Does that then mean that this document exemplifies fear of homogeneity? The entire paper itself is rooted in a fear of difference. It's the fear of those who oppose far left-wing ideology. Because really, the way that they have structured this document, what it has is that the alt-right sort of rests at the center of the left's hate-fear nexus. The alt-right is essentially the other in this view, and the mainstream media is ultimately the friendly version. It's on the good guy side, and Obama is basically like the granddaddy, and Hillary is the grandmama, who we are all supposed to bow down to. In another point, it says here, a cult of masculinity that tends to manifest itself in an obsession with sexual politics, refer to online pickup artistry and the heteronormative gender roles embodied in the nuclear family, which of course the left hates the nuclear family and has long been working to try to eliminate it. And in another wildly inaccurate sentence we find here, they say, the, quote, cult of tradition surfaces in fringe movements associated with the alt-right that advocate a return to an imaginary past where men were men, immigration was limited, and so forth. So they say this was imaginary, but this was really the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So how is that imaginary? One can only guess. moving down a bit further, we find them saying, alt-right ideology is hardly new. In his incisive report, note this one is called incisive and the previous report was referred to as perceptive, report on the origins and ideology of the alternative right, Matthew Lyons identifies two groups rooted in fascism and opposed to neoliberal promotion of immigration and globalization in the name of free trade. The first are the paleoconservatives, who in the 1980s rallied against mainstream neoconservative thinking on free trade, interventionism, and immigration. They are the modern incarnation of the isolationist America First movement of the 1940s. Now, isolationist in the left-wing and mainstream media parlance is always supposed to be a really dirty, nasty, bad word, but really the position of so-called isolationism is the same one that George Washington advocated of not getting involved in foreign entanglements, i.e. not being interventionist and going and bombing other countries to force them to bow down to your ways. We continue here. The second are the European New Right, who attempted to rebrand fascist ideology by appropriating liberal language and strategies and opposed multiculturalism and globalization. So what is ultimately wrong with these things? I mean, they just presuppose that they're all correct and good and nice and wonderful, but I don't see any arguments in here as to why, say, Japan remaining Japanese is really good or bad, or why Hungary remaining Hungarian is good or bad, or Nigeria remaining Nigerian, or Guatemala remaining Guatemalan is good or bad. There are no arguments put forth in here. It's just presupposition stacked upon presupposition upon presupposition. And as we continue down in the article, they start to drag in quotes from the SPLC, which is really just nothing more than another wing of the DNC, very much like the ACLU has become. They're both just wings of the Democratic National Party complex. And we find in these sections here, they say when they're referring to the men's rights movement or men's rights activists, they say, these communities share a common vocabulary and often overlap with the alt-right and neo-reactionary movements. Well, I would imagine that some also shop at Target and on Amazon.com. Does that then link them? Does that then link all of us ultimately to things that the left deems to be bad? Then they move on from the men's rights groups to attacking the pickup artist groups, which I don't actually read really anything they do and don't know very much about them at all. But it says here, on such boards, men swap tips on how to be more alpha and attract women through a variety of tactics. So Cosmo doesn't do that, Teen Vogue doesn't do that, makeup magazines, they don't do that. Very interesting, the blatant double standard here. Next, they move on to attacking conspiracy theorists, a term that, of course, was popularized and spread by the CIA. Several internet platforms have become fertile ground for the growth of conspiracy theories, without the barrier of traditional media gatekeepers. See, that's ultimately what they want. Remember, the mainstream media sets the opinion, the allowable forms of opinion that you can have and things that you can talk about. Amateur filmmakers can post their own conspiracy, quote, documentaries to YouTube. So if it's a conspiracy documentary, it's not really a documentary. It's one that needs to be put in scare quotes because that makes it less real, less legitimate. Who knows? Then they go on to say that sometimes conspiracy theorists hold anti-Semitic views, but then they don't point out that the left is often extraordinarily anti-Semitic in their continual attacks on Zionism and on Israel and their support for Palestinian terrorism and things of that nature. They don't condemn that version of terrorism. They support that. They think that's actually really good and that to attack and kill Israelis is a really good thing, but somehow it isn't anti-Semitic to promote that. I don't know what to do with this. And then they move into explaining to us certain things. They say, conspiracy theories are driven by a belief in the machinations of a powerful group of people who have managed to conceal their role in an event or situation. Does one think here Trump and Putin at all? No, that's not a conspiracy theory because CNN and the New York Times told me so. These theories have existed for hundreds of years, and with early believers arguing that the Illuminati and secret Jewish factions were secretly plotting to take over the world. More recent conspiracy theories have focused on alternative accounts of specific events, such as the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which was mainly a left-wing conspiracy theory movement, and the Sandy Hook elementary school shootings. The overarching themes of these theories have remained remarkably consistent. They reliably express anxieties about loss of control within a religious, political, or social order. See, they always try to put it into this sort of psychologization, that it's an anxiety that someone's experiencing, that whites have anxiety or males have anxiety. But of course, there's no counter version of this where they say, well, we actually have some kind of sympathy for the psychological disorders that people are apparently suffering from. It's amazing how that goes right out the window. As we move on now to page 19, as they continue the attack on conspiracy theorizing, they do what the left did all throughout the 1990s, and they attempt to link any kind of right-wing conspiracy theories to the idea that people are going to be like, say, Timothy McVeigh and engage in the Oklahoma City bombing and things of that nature. And following McVeigh, what they did back then is they repeatedly tried to blame things on right-wing talk radio. They said that Rush Limbaugh was really dangerous. He was really scary and extremist and all of that. That bit seems to have faded a little. They also, back then, they would drag in the Promise Keepers. They said that the Promise Keepers were going to be really bad, and maybe they suggested that all of these groups had some kind of associations with militias, and they also really tarnished the concept of being a patriot back then, which now they're demonizing the idea of being a nationalist, that, they try to directly link that over to white nationalism, even though, black people obviously can be nationalists in the United States as well as Hispanics or anyone else who lives here and loves the United States, right? And really all throughout this document, I would say that the two names that probably turn up the most in terms of who they are attacking, of course, is Trump number one, far and away. But number two, probably a fairly close second, would be Alex Jones. He repeatedly comes up in here for various attacks. On page 20, they move on to a category they call influencers. And it says here, a range of prominent online trolls, gamers, ideologues, and conspiracy theorists hold outsized influence among the other actors and play a distinct role in media manipulation efforts. As significant nodes in these networks, they hold the power to amplify particular messages and make otherwise fringe beliefs get mainstream coverage. And by fringe beliefs, here, of course, they mean non-left-wing beliefs. I'll skip down to the next paragraph. It's beginning. It says, these men often rise to prominence due to a particularly nuanced understanding of technological platforms or attention hacking tactics. Now, again, why would you use hacking there? That is certainly not a scholarly term at all in a document that purports itself to be scholarly. It is coded as a bad term, an emotionally loaded term. Why would you not use attention gaining tactics instead? It's also interesting here in the final paragraph on this page. It says, the novelty of the method and involvement meant that the original message, which probably only a few hundred people saw, was immensely amplified by media coverage. Well, by their very own reasoning, by the standards of this report itself, reporting on these groups is bad because are they not amplifying all of the people mentioned inside of this document? Next, on page 21, and I'm saying the page number so that those who are following along can see where I am as I do this. Hyper-partisan news outlets. In the last 10 years, an extensive hyper-partisan right-wing network of news websites and blogs has emerged. That would be because of left-wing suppression for decades. That's why they've emerged. While there is a long history of the American radical right taking advantage of new media from anti-communist radio networks in the 1950s, well, I guess they shouldn't have had those, right? Because communism was nowhere. To Limbaugh and Beck in the 1990s, the current network goes far beyond Fox News. Interesting here that they don't point out that the left has CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, and PBS, supported by taxpayer dollars, of course. It continues here, Breitbart is at the center of this new ecosystem, along with sites like the Daily Caller, the Gateway Pundit, the Washington Examiner, InfoWars, Conservative Treehouse, and TruthFeed, many of which have only existed for a few years, and of course the left would like to drive them into non-existence. Some may be categorized as the alt-right media, which parrot some far-right talking points while strategically excluding more extreme beliefs. This is the gatekeeping and boundary policing that the left is so fond of and wants to happen more and more, which is ultimately also what this document is about. And I want you to pay close attention to the next paragraph here, how they elide the differences in terms and meanings. During the 2016 election, many of these sites published articles in support of Donald Trump's agenda, including anti-immigrant rhetoric. Notice here, anti-immigrant is a blanket sort of term that elides over the difference between both legal and illegal immigration processes. And the next sentence, it's the level of hypocrisy is absolutely stunning. Even for the left, it's stunning. It simply beggars belief. It says, while research shows that most Clinton supporters got news from mainstream sources like the New York Times and the Washington Post, i.e., far-left ideological groups that hate Donald Trump, many Trump supporters were surrounded by this far-right network, which peddled heavily in misinformation, according to them, rumors, conspiracy theories, and attacks on the mainstream media. A study by far-left group BuzzFeed found that during the 2016 election, articles from hyper-partisan news outlets inspired more engagement on Facebook than those from mainstream media sources. Of the top 20 articles, with the most engagement, 17 were pro-Trump or anti-Clinton. Well, isn't this simply a measurement of popularity? Oh no, that couldn't possibly be the case, right? And BuzzFeed, of course, is a constant source for, crazed far-left hyper-partisan lunacy that just gets spewed out on a daily basis. And on page 22, we find the first paragraph ending with this sentence. And even if the mainstream news was reporting on it in shock or disgust, it still led millions of viewers and readers to be exposed to these ideas. These are various conspiracy theories. But notice here that they talk about the ideas as if they are some kind of radiation or radioactive elements or something like that. Maybe you need a Geiger counter when you're exposed to these ideas. And can no one remember that all through the 1990s, Hillary Clinton, and still even today, claims that Brother Bill's the victim of a far right-wing conspiracy? Funny how that never gets brought in for examination at all. On the next page, we find a snake or serpent that is formed out of a series of, it looks like maybe chat boxes, talk boxes, something like that, or perhaps even computer monitors. And it's interesting that they like to use biblical imagery in order to demonize their enemies, but they don't really like the Bible itself so much. The next section is entitled, Where Do These Actors Operate Online? Social and participatory media is key to the manipulation of mainstream media. It enables those with relatively fringe views to find each other, collaborate on media production and knowledge dissemination, and share viewpoints that would be unacceptable to air in their day-to-day life. Interesting. I don't hear very many people who live around me afraid to say that they loathe and despise the mainstream media. That's a pretty common viewpoint where I am anyway. And they go on here for a few pages attacking everyone who they don't like as, racist, misogynist, bigoted, homophobe, all of the usual stuff that they like to throw in. But under the final part here, the concluding paragraph, I guess on page 26, under mainstream social media sites, it says, and YouTube gives a platform to conspiracy theorists and fringe groups who can make persuasive, engaging videos on outrageous topics. Who cares? Why do you care so much? So what if some wacko thinks that the world is flat? It doesn't matter. On page 27, we have what motivates media manipulators. Media manipulation, for some reason they put this in scare quotes also, covers an array of practices. On one hand, people circulate content to push their worldview, often using the mainstream media to increase their audience. We might more accurately call this propaganda. No, I would say this is called communication. What you engage in is propaganda. However, doesn't that reveal that it just depends upon one's worldview, one's perspective? We come down here a bit more under ideology. They say, for example, dislike of political correctness dates back to the early 1990s when conservative commentators accused colleges and universities of suppressing conservative thought in favor of radical left-wing ideology. I would like to point out that that actually did not begin in the 1990s. It began with a left-wing professor known as Alan Bloom when he wrote The Closing of the American Mind, which I've covered on another episode here. He actually started it in an article written in 1982 for National Review. And you can check out my video, I will link it below, where it talks about that. And yes, this kind of closed-mindedness started among the left all the way back then, and even further, really. And down on page 29, we find a section called Radicalization. Far-right movements exploit young men's rebellion and dislike of political correctness to spread white supremacist thought, Islamophobia, and misogyny through irony and knowledge of internet culture. Again, I would point out here that they are engaging in amateur psychologizing of people who they don't like. And again, they are eliding the differences between libertarians, traditional conservatives, and white supremacists, of which there's like maybe a couple of dozen across the United States. This is not a serious or real movement at all. But the left always tries to tar and feather everything they don't like with that moniker. Down on page 33, we find an image of the same screaming person that has been repeated throughout the article, basically vomiting black bile down upon the globe and some other objects. It's very rather hideous image, I would say. Rather dehumanizing image. Far worse, again, than the NPC meme. Over on page 40, they move into a section called Why is the Media Vulnerable? Note here that the mainstream media is referred to as vulnerable despite the fact that 5 or 6 multinational corporations control the media and they're worth, all told, hundreds of billions of dollars, but they're vulnerable to a few trolls online. In the opening paragraph it says, concerns about the news media have amplified in recent years across the political spectrum. While right-wing critics argue that liberal elites dominate the mainstream media, that's true, left-wing theorists argue that the media is over-reliant on corporate and government sources. Also true. Panders to advertisers, ignores dissenting voices, and supports the status quo. In many ways that's true because the status quo is this far-left progressivist ideology. Such widespread distrust of the mainstream media from both the left and the right helped create the conditions for both the emergence of the hyper-partisan far-right press and subcultural media manipulation. Next section, lack of trust in media. Trust in the mainstream media is at an all-time low. Excellent. There's many hundreds of good reasons for that. A Gallup poll released in September 2016 found that Americans' trust in the mass media, quote, to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly was at 32%, the lowest in the organization's polling history. Should be about 2%, I would say. While confidence has been falling relatively steadily throughout the 21st century, the number fell a steep 8 percentage points from 2015, marking the trend as particularly prevalent in the past year. A Data and Society report found that most teens expressed distrust of the news and assumed that much of it is biased, and they would be right to do so. It continues here. It is also worth noting that, according to Gallup's poll, trust in the mainstream media is particularly low among right-wing and Republican survey participants at only 14%. And really, this is, necessity is the mother of all invention, as Nietzsche said, and that is why the right has come up with all these other ways to deliver data and information and indeed allow people of like mind to talk to one another. In a later paragraph, it says, however, such lack of trust has other recent precedents. For instance, leading up to the Iraq War, the New York Times published a number of articles that indicated Iraq may have been in the process of developing weapons of mass destruction, which everybody knew was a lie. The coverage was cited by the Bush administration officials to support or bolster support for the invasion, but it was later revealed that the Times reporting was largely based on faulty information. In a 2004 mea culpa, the paper admitted that it should have been pressing for more skepticism. Did they use this skepticism when they were reporting on Syria and Obama and Hillary blew that place to smithereens and they destroyed Libya, creating an open-air slave market in northern Africa. Has there been any kind of roundabout explanation for why they've supported that and promoted that? Nope, absolutely not. What they engage in is blame shifting and absconding their own responsibility for what they're involved in. Over on page 47, we have their conclusion, where basically they just engage in a whole lot of lament about the loss of captive audiences and Drumpf. And over on page 49, under a section of their questions that remain as sort of open puzzle pieces for them, under one of the bullet points it says, how much are these processes affected by platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google? Are there technical solutions that can be implemented? And this is, of course, exactly what is being engaged in right now, as we have a series of mass bannings that have taken place after InfoWars and Alex Jones was taken down, rather infamously, as he was unpersoned all across the internet, everywhere they could possibly knock him off. And now they're going for many of the lesser lights on both the left and the right, by the way. It's very interesting how that's happened. Under another bullet point, it says, who influenced the Trump campaign's tactics, frames, and priorities? See, they want to be able to get into the OODA loop on that and disrupt those as well. I suppose in my own conclusion about this, really the only thing that I can compliment this for is, of course, bolstering my own thesis that the left is going to continue to lose overall because they do not understand people who oppose them right now. I would have to compliment them on the fact that they didn't drag in David Duke's name repeatedly, which is what was done all throughout the 1990s. But of course, they've just used a new stand-in for that with Richard Spencer. And every time they want to demonize anybody who doesn't like them, they just say Richard Spencer, whereas they used to say David Duke, David Duke. And as I said at the beginning, that will conclude part 2. Part 3 will be on the AIN, or Alternative Influencer Network, the article on that called Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube. And for the concluding portion of this overall group will be the Atlantic Council's Whose Truth, Sovereignty, Disinformation, and Winning the Battle of Trust. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.